Behold the Trees by Sue Alexander, illustrated by Leonid Gore. Trees, leaves, twigs, branches, bark-covered trunks, roots going down into dark, damp soil, shields for the earth against the searing sun and driving winds. This is the story of one land and its trees. It begins a long, long, very long time ago. Oak and almond, fig and olive, terebinth and palm, acacia and pomegranate, willow and tamarisk. They grew wild when the land was called Canaan. They grew at the edge of the great sea, in the valleys and on the hillsides, along the shore of the Sea of Kinneret, and on the oases of the wilderness. Living, life-giving trees. Fields were cleared, plowed and planted. Wooden doors were made for homes and shops in the towns and cities. Stables and sheds were built. Fires sent twists of smoke into the air as people cooked and warmed themselves when the cold winds blew. And no new trees were planted to take the place of those that were cut down. But trees still grew on the hillsides, in the valleys, along the shores of the sea, and on the oases of the wilderness. Living, life-giving trees. So it was, through a siege of wars that lasted more than 600 years. One after another, the armies of Assyria, Babylonia, Persia, Greece, and Rome swept through the land, destroying what had been built. The Romans called the land Palestine, and, like each of the armies before them, cut down trees to build fortresses and palaces, shrines to their gods, cities and towns. And no new trees were planted. But trees still grew in stands and groves and great forests. They still held back the sea, cooled the air, and protected the earth for the people and animals who lived there. So it was, through the days of Jesus, James and John, Peter and Paul, and the Christians who came after them. In the hundreds of years that followed, more wars were fought for possession of the land, and more trees were lost. Soldiers cut down trees to build catapults and wheeled shooting towers, and burned whole forests so their enemies would have no place to hide. With fire and swords, they destroyed the trees that grew along the shore of the sea, so no invaders' ships could come upon them unseen, and no new trees were planted. Through the years, many mosques and churches had been built, and people began to come from around the world to visit what had come to be called the Holy Land. The Turks, who now ruled the land, ordered trees to be cut down to build roads and bridges, tracks for trains, and places for travelers to stay. Over time, the Turks began to fight among themselves and with other nations, and the land was ignored. Farms were abandoned and cities and towns were deserted. Black goats roamed freely, eating all the plants and chewing up trees by their roots. Then, a little more than 100 years ago, a group of Jewish settlers came to the land. They tried to plow and plant, but little would grow. So they began to plant trees. First they planted a small grove of olive trees, and then one of cypress and pine. But again, war spread throughout the land. Most of the trees and the last of the forests were split into ties for railroad tracks. The rest became fuel for the trains. Few trees remained. Oak and almond, fig and olive, terebinth and palm, acacia and pomegranate, willow and tamarisk. They no longer grew in the valleys, on the hillsides, or along the shores of the seas and on the oases of the wilderness. There were few wild stands or groves, and no more great forests. There were not enough trees left to hold back the sea, cool the air, or protect the earth. And the land became salt marsh and sand. Without trees to sustain them, the animals and birds disappeared. Gazelles and antelope no longer roamed the hillsides or lingered in the valleys. No owls or doves remained to soar through the air or trill their songs. After the war was over, more people came to settle on the land. They lived in abandoned buildings and tents, and they planted trees. In homes and shops all over the world, Jewish people had been putting pence and pounds, centimes and francs, pfennigs and marks, centavos and pesos, guilders, rands, florins, dimes and dollars into small blue banks to buy trees for the land. They celebrated happy events in their lives and commemorated sad ones by giving money to plant trees. Then, during another great war, less than half a century later, many Jewish people sought shelter in the arid land. After the war, they built their own villages, towns, and cities, and they planted trees. Old people, middle-aged people, and young people dug the earth, and month after month, year after year, planted, one by one, hundreds and thousands and millions of trees. Cypress and pine, eucalyptus and acacia, orange and olive, lemon and pecan, oak and palm. They all grow now in the land called Israel. They grow at the edge of the Mediterranean Sea, in the valleys and on the hillsides, along the shore of the Sea of Galilee, and in the wilderness. They grow in stands and groves and great forests. They hold back the sea, cool the air, and protect the earth for the people and animals who live there. Behold the trees.